Cool, man. How's it going?
Good, good. How are you?
Good. I was just working on our last week's podcast episode this morning, and it was fun because it was the first time that I had heard about useOptimistic, and it was fun watching myself go back through like learning about it, and then it came up this week, and like we were talking about it this morning too. So it's pretty neat that like it has a lot more use cases than I initially thought, having gone through that episode last week. And last week, mostly we talked about using it for like mutations and how it compared to my experience doing optimistic UI and Remix.
Hmm.
But it feels like a little bit more lower level.
For sure.
And it goes beyond just actions.
Yes. I have a pause here because the docs explicitly say it's for
I know.
actions.
I
But
know.
yes, as we figured out this week, yeah.
Yes. Yep. So, uh, let me kind of set the stage, I guess, and just talk about how we came to discover another use case for it. So, I have been doing some pairing actually this last week or two, and it's been a lot of fun. Just put out like a little call on Twitter, and I've probably done like 6 or 7 pairs. I need to tell you about the one I did with Roman yesterday because it was really neat.
Cool.
But I did one with a guy who was working on query params, filter query params in a search, and basically wanting them to be instantly responsive in Next.js. And this has come up before. We've seen this before where I think the router.push in Next 12 like instantly updated the like the URL in the browser, and then it like refreshed the back.
I think
The
I think it I think it depends. I think it depends on if you're using like static props or server side props. I think the
got
behavior
you.
changes, but
Right.
for the most part, like yeah, happy path next is like you're building a static site. You're doing
That
like
does
the
data
SSG
fetching,
thing.
SWR.
Yeah, it data fetches on the client, so you're building. And
Mm-hmm.
again, you can build it other ways, but it's like kind of like the
Right.
happy path, the next 12 story.
Right.
And so
Right.
you would get these instant updates. You're never like you were never like taking time to go to another page, if that makes
Right.
sense.
You always had a blocking. You always had a skeleton to show instantly
Yeah, of course
or a
you
shell.
could do other ways to do this, but that was a happy path.
Right. Yep. Whereas Happy Path in the next 13 is click, block, transition kind of thing, which is nice for pages. And then you can add, loading states and suspense boundaries to have faster navigation. But you still have a round trip to the server. You still have a round trip to the server as soon as you call router.push, right? And so if you're making something that involves filtering down a list and it feels like kind of like an SBA feeling page, then that blocking any interaction on a round trip to the server, even if you have like a suspense boundary or something further down that does a data fetching, it still doesn't feel quite right. Um, liking a tweet is something we talked about last week, but liking a tweet is like a mutation. This is more like a new GET request where you have like
Hmm.
a list of movies and you're clicking on genres. Most people doing React for the last decade want those genres to be selected as soon as you click on them. And then you want to start fetching the new data and somehow either show a spinner or something over the old movies until the new ones are ready.
Yeah, I
So,
think I think just to like we would say like when you select a genre, you're going to go to a new URL that with that genre in the URL. But that selecting the genre and going to the new URL should feel like it happens at the same time. And
right,
so everything feels instant. Where with
right.
in a
The,
transition
the
world in
default, yeah, yeah, the
next
default path
13,
with router push, it doesn't.
right? So you check the checkbox, and then there's time to when you route or push, and then that time, and then the URL updates.
So we talked about this, and before we realized that Use Optimistic was a perfect solution for this, I think you were the one that mentioned it. But the way we got there was first, Next has added support for the native history push state API to Next 13 and Next 14. So what that means is that inside of a client component, you can call window.history.pushState, to instantly update the URL. For example, to add a query param that says $genre equals horror, right? And what does it mean that they support it? Well, what it means is that the data returned from use search params and use path name are going to instantly reflect the new URL if you call the native history API. And those are hooks, remember, that are only used in client-side components, but they typically update after the new URL has been pushed. If you traditionally call something like router.push, you do that. The new app prepares, it commits or whatever, updates, and then those things will update. So given that they support the native history API, you can call, my first attempt at solving this problem was to use that. And actually, let me just take a step back and explain what the actual problem was, because part of the problem is the fact that it feels slow. You click on it and maybe you flip some state or something, or you click on a checkbox or, whatever. It takes some time. There's another problem though, which is that if you click horror and crime, and you click a second genre, a second filter, and that should update the query param, and the first click hasn't finished yet, the new app isn't ready yet, your second click is actually transitioning from state 0 to state 2, not from state 1 to state 2. So the route that you push doesn't include that first checkbox that you clicked, again, in the default happy path case, where you're just calling router push on these things. So this is kind of like, this is more of a bug than like a slow user experience. Does that make sense what I'm explaining?
Yeah, it does to me, because we've been talking about this a lot. I think it's hard to communicate without a visual. Yeah.
Let me try to explain from if you had a PHP or a Rails app. If you had a PHP or Rails app, you render a list of movies and then you have a list of checkboxes, right? That have genres, that filter it down by genres that match. So by default, you have 250 movies and then you have these 10 genres or whatever. Now, if you click on one of those checkboxes, and it could look like a button or any sort of tag, right? It's a tag. You click on it. That is going to link. Each one of those things is basically going to be a link, right? It's going to be a link to / with the right search param. It's going to have genre equals horror.
Wait,
so
question. Do you want to be able to select multiple of them, or are you just selecting one?
In Rails, let's just say you can select multiple, but it's like Amazon.com, where when you click a checkbox, you get a re-render, right? You go to the server and you refresh the page. So they're all links. So when you click horror, you are clicking a link to / genre equals horror. And you're going to Rails, and Rails is generating a new page, right? Mm-hmm. And the new page is going to render, the 100 movies that are filtered down. But the sidebar is going to have all of the tags. The horror is going to be selected. It's going to be a link back to the home page that's unselected. And all the other tags are going to be links to / genre horror and their own genre version, right? So you're doing a full re-render using the fact that the request included an initial, a genre search param.
Sure.
Yep. So it's all just total re-render and links all the way down. So that is the way to think about it. That's the easiest way to build this page, right? Every link click gets a new version of the page from the server, and all the links are updated to include the current set of search params at the time of the request. So if you build it like that in Next, and you just call router push, and then, you pass the search params down, or you use search params in the client or whatever to render links, those search params aren't updated until the server has reloaded the new page. And so if you click two things fast, I guess it would be similar to how it would work in Rails. If you kind of like clicked one link and then clicked another one right away, you would just be clicking the second one because that first one hadn't flipped yet, right?
Right.
So so this is kind of where people head down, right? You're kind of nudged to do router push, to push new URLs to the page, to your app. You then click on the thing, and if the horror tag shows its active state based on search params, it's not going to update until the page makes a round trip from the server. And you're like, what the heck? I'm writing a React app. This should toggle immediately. I need to respond immediately to user feedback. So what I'm going to do is set some state, And as soon as I click on it, I'm going to keep track of which ones I've toggled so that they can go flip from white to blue immediately. And then I'm going to push the URL. And now you run into the situation where like you're trying to figure out what the selected genres are in case they click 1, 2, 3 really quick and try to push a URL. So it gets really messy. And if you start using state to update which ones are selected, and then you hit the back button, right? Then now your app is probably not going to work because really the source of truth is the URL in that case. But in the case where they've clicked, it feels like the source of truth is state. So this is kind of like the journey we went down. And the next stop on the journey was the native history support. So you say, really, all I want to do is I want to click a link, update the URL, and I don't want to have to wait to go to a round trip for the server, even if I'm just fetching like a shell or a load, whatever. I don't want to have to go to the server to update because I could click 1, 2, 3 really quick. Oh, Next has support for the native history API. Why don't we try that? I'm going to call push state, window.history.pushState in my event handler when I click. And that way the URL is going to be updated immediately. And use search params and use path name, the hooks from Next navigation, update immediately as well. So now each one of those genre filters can use search name, use path name. They can see, use search params and use path name. They can see if they're selected. And as soon as you click it, then it will flip it immediately. And so now the second and third click that are happening can take into account the fact that the first one's there as well because it's already in the URL. Then the question is, well, okay, you've updated the URL right away, and the URL is kind of like client-side state now. It's kind of like in the browser, and so it's updating immediately, but we need to like sync it to the server. So how do we reload the page? Because we still want the list of movies to be like a server component or to involve a server component to do the data fetching, right?
Yeah, push state is not an API for going to the server. Push state's an API for like entering a record into like the browser's back forward cache.
Exactly.
Back forward history, I guess is a better way to say that. Anyway, yeah.
And I think router.push eventually calls those things, right?
What do you mean?
I think it has to.
Router push will go to the server and insert.
And then after it'll call
insert
history.pushState. Yeah.
But if you were just doing, you're like, in your example here, you're using push state to update the URL instantly, right. So right. That like the state, so that the hooks use search params and the other use path name instantly update. So it's kind of like, you send the action up, data flows back down into all your components. Right. But the problem with that is that you are updating the URL so you can actually go to the server and fetch new data. Like this right. URL is like, hey, give me this new data. But in this case, push state is not made to like go to the, you know what I mean? Like if you wrote like just outside of React, outside of Next.js, if you just wrote a script tag and you called push state inside of it, you would see like the URL update, but you wouldn't see any API requests being made to your server.
Right, exactly. So you're kind of taking ownership of this and you do that. And then you say, well, I do need to refresh the page. So maybe you use an effect that watches changes to search params and path name. And if it does, you call router.refresh. And that way you have this kind of instant navigation, instant search params, but then you have like a reloading of the page. And well, that doesn't really work either. I don't really understand it. I don't think we ever looked at it together, but it would kind of work like every 2 clicks.
Always a great sign.
And I think it's because actually, if you think about it, maybe it's like you're updating the history, you're pushing a new state, and then you're calling router refresh, but router refresh is reading from like the current router, next router state, and so
you would have to right. You'd have to wrap it in an effect.
Yeah,
I think I saw someone share an example with you where like they wrapped it in a promise, which is like the equivalent.
It's just like a hack of like basically using the fact that there's probably some tick
work in between.
Yeah, exactly.
So like you could wrap it in a set timeout that fired in 100 milliseconds.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Those are just proxies. They're not really.
I think the effect version would
probably works,
but you are you're using push state and then you're calling router refresh. Like when you look at those two things, like that's a job of Next's router push. And
Right.
you're
Exactly.
in a bad spot if you're like, oh, I need to
A,
reinvent these
a state
APIs.
machine for the router. Yes, exactly. So then we were talking about it kind of right at that moment. And I was like, we were talking and it was like, it's so weird because you call push state and you're kind of saying like the client knows at this point I've clicked horror and I know that horror should be selected. The user clicked on it. So this is like client side state. But like the URL, I don't really own that. We always think of like syncing to the URL. But when I click it and when the new app is refetching from the background, I want it to be state. So then we started playing with React State, right? And we had like the selected genres as React State. You default them to the genres that are passed in from the server, from the request URL. And then once you start clicking things, you set selected genres to this new version. And then we were like, well, if the props come back, I want that to be true. But if the props are like in flight, I want to use selected genres client side. And you were like, that's useOptimistic. And we were like, oh, shoot, And we tried it out and it was like a perfect fit for it. So that was pretty cool.
I mean, dude, it brought 60 lines of code down to like 7. It was ridiculous.
Yeah,
It was ridiculous.
it's crazy. So I'm trying to think about what we talked about after we kind of coded this and went on a walk because there were some interesting things that came out of it. But one thing I want to were we gonna say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say like kind of there's this in between point. You kind of hit on this, but there's this in between point where you are you click a checkbox or you click a button and you want to immediately toggle that to give feedback, but then you're also kicking off a server request. And so at that point, like the client, you can't just derive the state from like the URL or the server data because that hasn't happened yet. And the client actually knows more. The client knows more. The client knows what state the app should be in because the client just received the click.
Right.
And then and then you kick off a transition to this new state, and then the new state renders, and you were saying like you reset it. But like, I guess like the way I've been like how I've been thinking about RSCs over the last year and stuff, like as soon as like I'm in a spot where it's like the client should know more, it's like reactive, it's interactive. Like those are kind of terms that like are like a hint towards this. Like I immediately reach for like client component and state just kind of as a default. And like, even if it gets messy and stuff like that, it's just kind of like the default thing that I go down. And then like, then we talked about the transition and how we're like transitioning to this new state. I don't know if you want to like.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that because I think you've worked more with this stuff than me. And when we were walking and talking, it was like it's almost hard for it's like almost a curse of knowledge now because just in the last week of us talking about this, I have like a little bit of my brain's been rewired. But last week, like I was so confused. Like I am pushing a new URL and router.search names or search params, use search params is not updating. Like if I was building this, use in our own app and we had to build a router, use search params would be like React State that like sets new state when you call set search params or whatever, and it uses an effect to call push state with the history API and it returns the new state. It is client side state. Like how is it not client side state? And how is it not updating right after I called router.push? You know what I mean? Like I was genuinely really confused about that because of working with Ember and even Next.12 where things are static and I'm building a React app and I'm just, I'm doing things on the client. I'm clicking a counter. That's immediately updated. I'm pushing URL state. That's immediately updated, right? So
Yeah.
that's not where I was starting from last week.
Gotcha. I think there's a big unwind that has to happen here because we're writing in a world of server components and we have like we need renders that are going to happen on the server and there's going to be latency there. We can't just update state and just get a sync render on the client now. I think it's good to unwind and think about like how forms work. So imagine you're on a checkout form and you enter all your details and then you click buy. The URL doesn't immediately update to like thank you for your purchase.html. like you're just going to sit there and you're going to see a spinner for a few seconds. I mean, it's a checkout form. You might see it for like 10 seconds.
Right.
The URL still says like /checkout. And you know how all these like forms that are like, only click checkout once.
Yeah.
Don't click it more than once. Like,
Yeah.
there's a reason for that, because you
Yeah.
could, while that form is running, like say it takes 10 seconds, at second 5, you could like click the logo to link back to the homepage. And like your browser is just going to like, okay, you click the link to the homepage. I'm going to go off and fetch that.
It's going to
now.
discard the currently pending version of the app that's being prepared. It's going to discard it.
It's just going to be like, okay, you submitted this form, but you're clearly no longer interested in it. Let me go fetch the homepage. And then like, it doesn't really wait around for like, you go to the homepage, the browser doesn't then say like, oh, hey, that form you submitted like a few seconds ago? It turns out that's ready. Are you interested in that? No, the browser's
Exactly.
just like, no, you're interested in the homepage. And so like, yeah.
I was going to say, and if you clicked home logo while it was completing, it doesn't go to success until after it's done. You go home. So if you hit back, you would go back to checking out, and the completed page has been discarded forever. It was never visited. It was never completed and committed to the screen. It's its own universe. It's its own version of the app. It's its own state of the app that was discarded because you aborted it by doing something else, and therefore it's never part of the movie of your experience on this website.
Right. And but also too, like, you did submit the checkout form, so like it did like run on the server.
The action did run, but in terms of the UI that's being updated. So given this conversation, and that's exactly what you were saying, which was really good on our conversation during our walk, which was what happens when you submit a form or even click a link in HTML with a browser without JavaScript, right? And the URL doesn't update immediately. It goes into a state of preparation. And this is what a transition is. So transitions, I think, have a lot more intuition behind them than at least I had, and maybe a lot of people had, because the API feels a little low level. I think there's a lot of education and benefits that could be had by people having a better intuition about what a transition is. And like, again, just the way we've been talking, I think you've been thinking about this a lot more than I have. And so when I was like, well, why isn't use search params updated? And you're like, well, the app is transitioning. And it's like, okay, yes, it's transitioning because router.push calls start transition under the hood. But like, that's like, why is that happening? Right. And it's just like your checkout example. The current checkout page can't reach into the success page to update its own UI. They're two different worlds. And the reason they're completely different worlds is because you might click the logo and abort, right? You might discard that world that is being prepared, that you are transitioning to. It's discardable. And because it's discardable, you can't reach into it. It needs to be kept in a separate universe in a black box, right? In the same way, in our next apps, when you call router push, you kick off a transition. You begin a transition to time 2. And that 2 world is in its own universe. It's in a black box, and you can't read from it to update world 1 right now, right? You can't read anything from it that is associated with it in world 1 because it could be discarded. That's the whole point. So if you're preparing 2, you might end up clicking 3 and 2 never gets committed. So you can't reach into that to use as part of 1, right? So that is why when you call router push, use search params doesn't update until it's committed. So this is exactly where useOptimistic comes in. Because
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, rather than thinking about it as reaching into worlds, like, use search params does not want to update until, like, the data that's screen that's rendered.
The function of state. The UI is a function of state. The state is associated with it. Yeah.
So if we're on blog post 1 and we click a link to blog post 2, the search params that say we're on blog post 2 should not
Yeah.
update until blog post 2 is rendered. Because
Right.
if blog post 1 is rendered, but search params updates to blog post 2, like you have a mismatch.
Right.
Like,
Right.
so this is what like the whole idea behind transitions is you wrap your set states in a transition, and then you're basically saying, not until this screen is ready should
Right.
I see this state. So if I say
Right.
if I have like
I
movie
like that.
ID,
Not until this screen is ready should I see this state.
and then for whatever reason, like for whatever logic for what it means to be ready, we can get into. But like, yeah, if I set movie ID to 2, say I have a movie page, movie ID is 1. I'm not using transition. I'm just using regular React. I set movie ID to 2. Page is going to instantly re-render. Movie ID is going to be 2, and I'm probably using some library like SWR, React Query, or just use effects. And I'm going to kick off a fetch request to go fetch movie ID 2. And so like, what do I like in that case? I need to like, oh, okay, the ID is 2, but the data hasn't been loaded.
Right.
So like I show a loading spinner.
Right.
And then I can get through that. But there's something weird that happens there, because when I go from 1 to 2, I immediately blow away 1. It's immediately blown away, and just a giant loading spinner fills the screen. And this is how most of us like think of SPAs and React. This is how we've been writing apps for like the last, I don't know, you and I like last like 15 years.
Yeah.
But there's something nice about like the checkout example that we gave, where like you can click links and you keep the old UI rendered while the next page is being prepared. It's like really nice because you can like abort, you can click something else. You're not just like flashing in content. So this is where transitions come in. Instead of just setting movie ID to 2, you do start transition, set movie ID to 2, close the transition. And in that case, React is going to keep your app in a world where the movie ID is 1. It's also going to go off and it's like basically going to fork your React app and start rendering another version of your app. You and I like to use the term in another universe.
Yeah.
With movie ID 2. And then
Yes.
when movie ID 2 is ready.
Right. And the reason that might take time, whereas in the case of the SPA, this is so interesting because in the case of the SPA, you're always like, we always need a frame. React always needs a frame. There's no async anything. There's no suspense. So when you switch the movie ID to 2, you blow away 1 and then you clear the cache and you show a loading spinner. In your case, you fork in the other universe, it sets it to 2. And when it's ready, well, why does it take time to be ready? Because it's suspense. Setting ID to 2 might trigger, that causes a re-render, might throw a promise. And if it does, then this fork is not ready to be merged into main yet, right?
Yes. That is like, to me, that is like the most, as a web developer, it's like you are triggering a suspense boundary, therefore you're not ready. Like
Right.
that is like the reason why you're not ready. But
Right.
But
Yep.
and then once you're ready, then you can say, okay, the movie ID is 2. All the suspense boundaries are resolved, and I can just go and paint this page. I can replace page 1 with page 2 the same way that I can replace the checkout page with a thank you page as soon as the server responds with thank you.
Right. Right.
And
Very
and
cool.
if you're in the middle of a transition, so you're transitioning from 1 to 2, and 2 is being prepared, and then you go click a link to blog post 3, you don't have to like. This is the beauty of it. You don't have to manage.
Beautiful.
You don't have to manage like these race conditions where it's like, oh, 2 might come back. Like if you were using effects, you actually have these race conditions. Like 2 might come back, but since the time I kicked off the request to fetch 2, like the user clicked 3. So now I've got this state that's like the ID that I'm actually interested in. With transitions, there's none of that. With transitions, it's just like, oh, you started transitioning from 1 to 2, but then you clicked 3. So we're just going to discard 2. And then we're going to go kick off a transition for 3. And when 3 comes back, we paint it. And it simplifies code so
brilliant.
much.
It's absolutely brilliant. Anyone who's done the SPA style like we have, where you do, set ID to 2, and then you clear the cache and wait, 3, but there's a promise in flight. React has basically given us it's a first class primitive for the idea of the app in transition, the thing that is in between these two things while they're not ready. And it also works for CPU bound stuff and network bound stuff, like in the original demo, which is awesome. But in instead of before, like thinking React always needs a frame to render, it's almost like now it kind of doesn't, because if you set state in a transition that causes a promise to be thrown and you don't have any suspense boundaries, right? If you had a suspense boundary, it does have a frame because it's going to render the fallback. So that's how you could get like a more instant, a faster, update, because it would render the fallback immediately, let's say, unless it was an update, right? But anyway,
Yeah. I know we are definitely taking a lot of liberty with this. But yes.
But it's the right idea. Always needed a frame, and now it's like you don't, because it's basically, again, the browser with HTML and CSS. You can click links and they can be fast, but you can click links and they can be slow. And by default, you just are sitting there staring at the last page, for 10 seconds while the checkout's happening. So that's really what's happening. The amazing thing about transitions in React that is not just, oh, didn't we just re-implement the browser all over again? What's the point? The point is, because that transition is a separate thing, the app that's in transition while it's showing the old UI is 100% responsive. So, and it can also be updated. You can call set state and React can re-render the app in that is current, the current UI, while 1, 2, or n versions of your app are being prepared, and one of them will be committed, the rest will be discarded. No matter how many that's happening, no matter how long that takes, the current UI is always responsive. So this is the missing piece. And it solves the search params with the movies and the genre filter, because when you build it first and you click on a genre, it's as if you clicked on it in a browser link, and you're making a request and you're sitting there staring at the old screen while the new one comes in. You want to associate new data with that transition state, right? That's basically what useOptimistic exactly lets you do. It lets you add state to the currently reactive app. You're basically merging ephemeral state from the current app, which is, I know that I clicked horror as soon as the user clicked it, with the set of genres from the server. And now I can use that to update my currently reactive app. But if the new version of the UI that we're transitioning to does complete and we override it, then we just go to time 2 and we throw away all that ephemeral state. So that's why useOptimistic is a perfect hook for this particular case, because you want this mix of basically client-side source of truth and server-side source of truth. And the docs say it's about actions. And last week, we talked about using actions to do something like make a Trello board and keep it snappy. But it's really more broader than that. It's really like use transition data or something like that. Because like only while the app... Go ahead.
Use like you predict the transition data.
Yes. It could even be not even predicted. It could be you do eventually like fall back and like merge in with like the app that is being prepared if it's committed. So you throw it away. But like your changes could be something different. It's like it doesn't even have to be predicted, right? It's lower level than that. You can do whatever you want with it. It's like use transition data, because it's data associated with an app that is has like a transition that's happening. If there's not a transition happening, if you're in a settled state, then it's not useful.
It's like set state at that point. It's like it feels like set state at that point.
Right. But every time the app settles down, then it reverts. It's like reverting to main. See what I'm saying? It's like
it's like set state was a really bad. It's like a no op. Like
it's like it's like you're keying your whole tree or something after the app settles, and you reset all of the states. In the intermediate time, you can go crazy with set state, and then there's like an update, and we're on version 4 of the app. Let's just key the entire tree by the version of the app that was committed, and now everything's going to reset again.
You know what we should do? You know what I think might be a good thing to explore here is that, like, you know how we gave the example of the checkout screen and it taking 10 seconds?
Yes.
So with the checkout screen, when like you're just waiting, like you're just sitting there and you're waiting for the next, you're waiting for 10 seconds for the thing to confirm.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, maybe we could say something like, listen, we know that the checkout's probably going to work, right? Like we know, we just like, I guess checkout's like tricky because there's like, credit cards involved. But like, let's just assume that like we probably assume that checkout's going to work. And like the HTML world, I don't know, maybe we just pop up a message like this is probably going to work. But with useOptimistic, we can actually put our app in a state
Yeah.
that we think it's going to be in
Yeah.
when the checkout completes. So we're still in the world
Or
where the checkout's running.
yeah, or you can transition to like a holding set, like a holding pattern where you're like you have a responsive app, right? That lets you do things like change your extras or pre-order snacks and movies, and
Yeah.
you're showing that the thing is working. But the logic is, as soon as the thing works, I want this part of the page to show success. Your checkout is complete. It also reminds me of like the YouTube uploader, right? The YouTube uploader in a purely HTML and CSS world would let you upload a video and you'd be staring at like an upload. It could only do one thing at a time. But in the case of, an SPA or something like it, something like what we're talking about, you can have it. Let's say as soon as it finishes uploading, we want to show you something, right? That can be being prepared, and you can use optimistic to update things. But as soon as the progress comes back from the server after that, like you just want that to be the source of truth. And so all that ephemeral state that's associated with an app who has a newer state that it's transitioning to, that we really want to win, as long as it's still valid, it's not discarded. That's the way to think about use optimistic.
Yeah. The uploader is an awesome example because the browser can just read the file. Like you've selected the file, the browser can read the
Right.
file from your computer. So the browser
Right.
knows how long the file is. It can create a
Right.
blob object to like play the file. You actually don't have to wait for the
Right.
thing to finish uploading. So you could like optimistically set the file. But
And you could optimistically do like edits and stuff too.
yeah,
or like
yeah,
hidden cards. Yep.
exactly.
And the
exactly.
title and everything.
And
Yep.
the file hasn't even been uploaded to the server
Yep.
yet. But that is still mutation. So that's like still mutation. Where what we use this for was for
The
basically
get request in the
settings.
movies.
Yeah, we use this we knew the search params wouldn't update until the server had rendered the next movie page. And so we use this to basically get instant feedback that like the search params were going to update. So we
Right.
like optimistically set the search params.
Right. And then you ask, why didn't you just use React State for this? Well, as soon as you hit the back button, you'll see why. Because now you need to clear the state when you hit back, because the search params are the source of truth. So that's the idea, right? If it's just way, way, way easier. So, and that could be, it doesn't have to be the search params, right? It could be any data that's passed in from the server.
Yep. Before we go, I have one
Mm-hmm.
like just small little, not small, but just like one little like thing about this. And man, this was really hard. Like it took, first of all, I've been asked about this a bunch of how do I do like filters, checkboxes, while also like lifting state into the URL. So I know others have struggled with it. It took you and I like 3 days to get here.
Yeah.
I'm really happy where we got.
Yeah.
But like it is impressive, and when you understand the optimistic and transitions, it all kind of clicks. But it took us 3 days.
It's not obvious. It is
get
not
here.
obvious that this is the way to solve this problem.
Yeah. Man, I was thinking about like what makes like languages and frameworks successful, because like at the end of the day, dude, you don't need React to build like a movie filter website. Like it's
Right.
awesome when you do it in React. We love React. We would always pick React
Right.
for doing that sort of thing. But like Amazon can be built in Java, and Shopify can be built in Rails, and you can build an amazing store experience like with React. Like the technology doesn't, I don't know if the technology like matters. I don't know. Like I do think it matters, but also there's not just like, this is the only way to build a store, right? Like, or this is the only way to build a checkout or filter or whatever we're going to call it. I think that like these tools, they need to make you like feel not dumb. It's like bonus points if you can feel smart, but they need to, like as a baseline, they need to make you feel not dumb. Like anytime I've been writing Rails, like when you describe the Rails example where you're just clicking links and re-rendering the links with like the current query param, and you just keep appending to it. Like that's just what I would do, and it just works, and I don't get stuck here for 3 days. like how to solve this thing. And there's a lot of things in React that that are the opposite of this. Like they make you feel smart. Like things like using hooks in React. Like I feel smart when I use hooks. Like I think that's like one of the reasons I love React. Like I feel smart when I'm using hooks, and like they compose, and I have business logic, and then I can like take that and flush it out and render it. Yeah, I just have this like kind of like this bad feeling of like this is like maybe it's like just an education thing, and like we need to like talk about it more and teach it more. But I just had a really bad feeling of like filtering items can't be this hard.
Yeah.
Like it just can't. And like I also think too, like if you're listening to this conversation, like you probably had a hard time. Like we're kind of all over the place. We're talking about optimistic, we're talking about HTML, we're talking about transitions. So it's just like
Client side is a source of truth during a transition, and then the server side becomes a source of truth.
And I think you can make this argument that it's like it's really elegant when you understand all these pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's really and like you know that like the client holds this data now. Oh, now the server holds this data. But man, you can't make people feel dumb when they're filtering a list of items.
They're not going to be successful with your framework. They're not going to turn to it again. I think that's what you're saying, right? If they're not, the way to make them successful, it may be the case that React is best thought of as a programming language for UIs, and that the mental models around these primitives are really amazing and composed together really well. But if you're making a framework for app developers, and you need to connect those things to the top, and of course, like things are new and changing a lot right now, so it's a new paradigm. But it's worth noting those things when the high level features that app developers are interested in building, common features, right?
Yeah,
but
I think
I really resonated with what you said. That there's times where, like when I was pairing with Roman and we did this like framer motion thing on top of a radix thing, and I was like, oh my god, React is like so freaking cool, man. Like serious. And it happens when we're working all the time.
It makes you feel smart. It makes you feel smart. Like it makes you feel smart, and that's why I want to like keep coming back to these tools.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's like the opposite end where it makes you feel dumb. I mean, seriously, like if I'm sitting there and I can't, first it makes me feel dumb.
I wonder. I think you're fine, because I think you're fine in saying that, because I would be curious how many React 13 app router apps are using useOptimistic as experimental, so that's fine. But
it's also
whatever they're doing,
it's really new.
Whatever they're doing to get around it, this is going to be a better way to do it, because it's like Andrew said, you are forking server side state, but eventually merging it. It's hard to do well, and so that's what this is for. Anyways, you're going to say two things.
It makes me feel dumb in two ways. Like one is like I don't know how to do it and it takes 3 days. But then the other is like I don't even know how to explain this to you, right? If I'm like explaining this to you and we're talking about transitions and optimistic and blah blah blah, I don't know. I kind of feel like someone that's like not all in on React would be like, dude, why what Also, there might like I do feel this way about React. Like hooks come out, we start fetching data with useEffect. People are like, oh, useEffect is awesome. It's so easy. And I remember this conversation you had where you were like, useEffect is the hardest thing ever. And so I was like, no, it's so easy. And then you like asked all these questions and they were like, oh yeah, it turns out, yeah, I guess it is pretty hard.
Yeah.
but the answer wasn't to teach people how to use effect. The answer was use SWR
right,
and React Query and all these libraries. So maybe
Aria and
yeah, maybe we're just on that path. But I don't know. There's something
maybe we're just too dumb. I mean, I'm from Florida, so maybe I'm just too dumb to use this. You know,
I feel like we just had a podcast about how to check boxes. You know what I mean? Like I just like it's
minutes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's
all right. No, anyways,
the solution is elegant, dude. The solution is elegant.
Yes,
and when you understand how this works with transitions and all that stuff, it is amazing. Also too, like let's be honest, if I was going to build this app, I would take what you discovered with this stuff and build it. It would be an amazing experience.
Yeah.
It would be unbelievably amazing. So
yeah. Yep. Cool, man. I think for me the big thing was like this transition stuff. I want to think more about it because I don't know if there's a good intuition built up around it, the way that like suspense has started to get that from conference talks and stuff over the last year. But I think transitions go a lot deeper than I was originally thinking. Like this is one use case for them, but I think there's a lot that we'll be thinking about in terms of thinking about our app and like, yeah, basically being forked in end states. We can discard these. That's why render has to be pure. That's why effects have to be cleaned up.
Yep.
Blah blah blah. All these things. So I think there's a lot there. But let's wrap it up for this week. And yeah, thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week.
See ya.
Bye.